please. Thank you. So my name is Ian Sim. I'm the president of Osher, and I could really think of no better way than starting my presidency by introducing today's summer lecture series. This is the 28th summer lecture series that we have been running. We've been doing it since 1997 and only missed 1 year, and that was because of COVID. And this year we have just a tremendous theme. It's preserving America's four freedoms, the heart of our democracy. So I think a very pertinent topic for the times in which we are today. So on behalf of Osher at Dartmouth, I would like to welcome all of you who are here in person in the Opera House here in Lebanon, New Hampshire, to welcome all those, our members and non-members, who are taking this on live stream. And I also want to extend a particular warm welcome to those of 9 sister Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes who are taking the live stream for their members. It's an impressive list, and let me tell you, we welcome the people from Brandeis University, Towson University, the University of Connecticut, University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, the University of Massachusetts in Boston, the University of Michigan, the University of Richmond, the University of Rhode Island, and last but by no means least, the University of Virginia. And again, they are taking the live feed for their members. Thank you. Well, I do have many thank yous to give today, so if you could please hold your applause to the end. First, I would like to thank the members of the 2025 Summer Lecture Series Committee. They've worked incredibly hard to bring this extraordinary event to you here today, and we have some volunteers who are actually working in the auditorium and out front today, collecting tickets and so on. So thanks to them. I'd like to also say thank you to our dinner hosts. I don't know if people know this, but the evening before, we like to have an informal dinner, usually in someone's home, for our guest speaker. And it's been a very nice event, and I thank our dinner hosts for the 6 speakers who will be hosting in the course of this series. Thanks to the people of the Lebanon Opera House for hosting us again, and thanks to their technical people and the technical people from Junction Arts and Media who are managing the live stream today. And lastly, I must thank the Osher at Dartmouth staff, without whom this would never happen. They are working so hard to make it happen. They're out at front now. You will be getting your coffee and cookies when the speaker has finished. And then a special thanks to our sponsors of this year's Summer Lecture Series. Their support is so important for us as we talk about these significant issues in a time. So first of all, our platinum sponsor, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation. Our gold sponsors for the series, Doyle and Lohman Financial Advisors, Kendall at Hanover, and The Village at White River Junction. And then our gold sponsors for today's session, Alice Peck Day Life Care and Mariner Wealth Advisors. My apologies if I've forgotten anyone, but please join me in showing our appreciation for all the support that these have shown. I would now like to turn the session over to our moderator. Today's speaker is Professor Ronald Edsforth. And to introduce our speaker, I'd like to now welcome onto the platform the moderator for today's session, Jean Garthwaite. Jean.
Thank you, Ian, very much. I should note that I'm a professor emeritus of history and a longtime colleague of Ron's, and I miss him very much in retirement in the many stimulating discussions that we had in the history department, and we'll get a taste of that today. I would like to go over first some rules of the road, and again to remind you to mute your phones if you haven't done so already. There's always somebody who hasn't, but please do so. But also note the exits in case of an emergency. There will be no questions during the speaker's presentation. There will be a Q&A session later, which begins around 10:30. Those in the auditorium were given index cards when they entered, and please write your questions legibly on those cards and drop your card in the box or in this red basket here in front of me on the stage. And I believe there's one at the back of the hall. And for those of you who don't have pens, there are pens and other additional cards here at the front. And for those on live stream, please enter your questions in the chat window, and your questions will be transcribed and given to us to consider. And if you'd like, please add your first name and location to your question. And then we would also like to invite you to a post-lecture discussion session in Osher's classroom 3A at 1 Court Street, which is just around the corner, which will be held immediately after today's lecture from 11:45 until 12:15. Now it's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Professor Ronald Edsforth. Ron has retired in 2019 after 26 years of teaching at Dartmouth. As a distinguished senior lecturer in history, Ron's research focused on the economic development and political culture of the United States since 1900. At Dartmouth, he offered courses in American political and economic history, American foreign policy, and global peace history. He also led the revival of Dartmouth's interdisciplinary War and Peace Studies program, serving as its first coordinators from 1998 to 2004. And then in 2006, Ron helped establish the Globalization Studies concentration in Dartmouth's Master of Arts in Liberal Studies, the MALS program. And he served as chair of Globalization Studies and MALS from 2006 to 2016. Ron's many published works include 4 major books: Class Conflict and Cultural Consensus, Popular Culture and Political Change in Modern America, Auto Work, and The New Deal, America's Response to the Great Depression. Then in 2020, Ron was the general editor of Bloomsbury's 6-volume A Cultural History of Peace, Antiquity to the Modern Age. And just personally, I think that Ron has made many contributions to the field of history, but it's his emphasis on peace studies, I think, will be perhaps his most important contribution, really a significant achievement. And he has a current book project called Who Will Save the Children? A History of Save the Children, 1918 to 1929. And this was a groundbreaking global humanitarian NGO that would set the model for others to come. Ron's lecture today is titled FDR's Four Freedoms, the Foundation of Modern American Liberalism and Global liberal internationalism. And join me now in welcoming Ron to this podium.
Very nice. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Glad you could get out nice and early for this lecture. When I was asked by Jean whether I'd like to do this, I was a little nervous because I haven't taught for a while and I haven't lectured to a big group in a while. But I felt like the subject was such a good one, and I'm not sure who's responsible for picking it, but it is such a good one. And the subsequent speakers are such good speakers on the individual topics, the individual four freedoms, and how they're being challenged today, that I felt like this would be something I'd really want to do. So it is a great pleasure to be here. One of my first days at Dartmouth, I attended a public lecture by a wonderful poet, Bill Cook. And Bill started, he was a poet, and he started the lecture with a poem. So I became quite famous among students for starting my lecture classes with poems. And I have two different lyrics here, and I'm not sure which one to start with, but thinking over it for the last couple hours, I was going to end on a down note, but I think I'll start on the down note because that's sort of where we're at, and I'll end with a more positive note. So I think you'll all know this one. I'll just recite it. I won't try to sing it. The Eastern world, it is exploding, violence flaring, bullets loading. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. You don't believe in war, but what's that gun you're toting? And even the Jordan River has bodies floating. Don't you understand what I'm trying to say? Can't you feel the fears I'm feeling today? If the button is push, there's no running away. There'll be no one to save with the world in a grave. Take a look around you, boy. It's bound to scare you, boy. And you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, how you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction. No, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction. Of course, that's 1965, #1 song by Barry Maguire, Eve of Destruction. I hope we're not on it, but boy, you turn on the news every morning and you feel like, oof, where is this all going to end up? We have to work together in movements and politics to change our priorities until we develop a coherent set of policies aimed at securing for everyone everywhere in the world, freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and the theme of this song, freedom from fear. Okay, so let me set the scene for my first slide, which will be of Franklin Roosevelt speaking to you from the Congress, annual address to Congress, State of the Union we call it, just after he had been elected for the third time, unprecedented, controversial. And he had won against a candidate, Wendell Willkie, who was himself an internationalist and not necessarily opposed to America's aid to the Allies, like Charles Lindbergh and the American First Movement that was very strong at the time was. But at this point in time, remember, it's January 1941, both in Europe and in Japan, fascists and imperialists are on the upswing, advancing. Britain stands alone in Western Europe. And in China, this horrible policy that still poisons Chinese and Japanese relations was in full form. The general orders to the Chinese army, to the Japanese army in China were steal all, everything of value, burn all, burn everything else, kill all the Japanese or Chinese people you can find, men, women, children, old people, everybody. It was a horrible time, the worst war, without a doubt, in the history of the world. So this is when Roosevelt goes to the Congress and gives this address. And the final paragraph of the address is a proclamation of the 4 freedoms, which we're going to see right now in this short video.
The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want, which translated into world terms means economic understandings which will secure to every nation a healthy, peacetime life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point and in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. This nation has placed its destiny in the hands and heads and hearts of its millions of free men and women, and its faith in freedom under the guidance of God. Freedom means the supremacy of human rights everywhere. Our support goes to those who struggle to gain those rights and keep them. Our strength is our unity of purpose to that high concept. There can be no end save victory.
So Roosevelt proclaims the 4 freedoms on January 6, 1941. He proclaims them. This is a sort of the seminal event that we're examining. There's a wonderful book called A New Deal for the World by Elizabeth Borgward, in which she describes what she calls plumb line history. And we can have the next slide, please. It starts with the event you're examining, and if you drop it down into the present, you see what it leads to. If you drop it the other direction, you see where it came from. This lecture is organized to do this first thing first, which is to show you where we're at, and then try to explain how Roosevelt got to that point on January 6, 1941. So we look back on this speech and the words he uttered as monumentally important. This is from 4 Freedoms Park in New York City. And there's a beautiful, next slide please, park on Roosevelt Island in the East River, in which the 4 freedoms are written in stone. They're displayed elsewhere. We can have another slide even. And there's a similar monument, a Roosevelt monument down in Washington. I found doing my research, there's 4 freedoms monuments in very small towns and cities all around the United States. This was a very important proclamation. And I'm using the word proclamation because these things were not established, even in the United States at that time. And I wonder if we could say they're established even now. So I actually have to tell you, the title of the whole series, Preserving Our 4 Freedoms, I think might be better written, Achieving the 4 Freedoms in the situation that we're actually in. But So we're looking at the creation of a monumental turning point in American history. Next slide, please. And what's really interesting about this is that this is Franklin Roosevelt's creation. This is one of his longest serving aides, Samuel Rosamond and friends, one of his three chief speechwriters, who were all there in early January 1941 to go over the speech he was going to deliver to Congress in a day or two. Here's what Rosamond wrote about that meeting. Roosevelt recalled, FDR announced he had an idea for closing section of the speech. These are his words, his thoughts. The three speechwriters had not seen them before. They were not intending to end the speech this way. We waited as he leaned back in his swivel chair with his gaze on the ceiling. It was a long pause, so it became uncomfortable. Then he leaned forward in the chair and dictated the four freedoms, so slowly that on a yellow pad I had on my lap, I was able to take them down myself in longhand as he spoke. Okay, next slide. So this is a key point here. This is Franklin Roosevelt's contribution to ideas, intellectual history, political history, global history. This is Roosevelt taking a few words to try to advance the cause of peace in the world at a moment of the greatest danger to peace in the world. And I think it's one of his most incredibly important creations. Now we'll do the plumb line down to the present. Next slide, please. So what does this lead to? How do you provide for freedom from want, especially, and freedom from fear, the two things that they had confronted all these New Dealers during the early 1930s and all through the 30s? How do you do it? You set up big institutions to stabilize the economy and to provide lending and other forms of assistance in order to promote recovery. We'll think Marshall Plan, which I don't have a slide on, but Marshall Plan is a good one, and development or redevelopment. And in 1944, some of you New Hampshire's people probably recognize the hotel on Mount Washington. There was a conference at Bretton Woods at the hotel in which the International Monetary Fund was established. And that was designed to stabilize currencies, which had gone completely erratic and dangerously out of balance during the Great Depression, and again, were completely skewed by the war. Next slide, please. It also leads to the establishment of the World Bank at Bretton Woods. Here's President Clinton speaking at its 50th anniversary in Geneva, where it is headquartered. And it also leads, at Bretton Woods, preliminary talks lead to the agreement, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which was 1949. But that is the predecessor to the World Trade Organization, which was supposed to, and is having great difficulty right now, establish basically a free trading world with very low or no tariffs at all, so that some of you who studied economics will know the principles of comparative advantage would work, and over time, every place in the world would benefit from what it could offer to the world. In some ways, the thought was equally. Of course, these three, in our time, these three organizations, IMF, World Bank, and World Trade Organization, become known as the Washington Consensus Institutions, because in less developed third world countries, they impose very strict political requirements to get any assistance from them. And this often meant the turning out of regimes that were not liked in Washington over these past, now, 70 years or more. Next slide, please. So another part of how do we achieve freedom from fear is how do we get rid of war? The world's biggest peace organization is the UN. And it is created initially out of ideas that these men and a slightly larger group of men, the man in the center is the American Secretary of State, Edward Stepanidis. The man next to him is Andrei Gromyko, the Russian foreign minister. Remember, the Soviet Union is an ally of the United States in World War II. They set up a plan for a United Nations organization that would be a peace organization and include all the nations in the world. But of course, it didn't work out as the idealists hoped it would, because the great powers, including the United States, did not want to surrender their power to small countries like Panama or Equatorial Guinea, etc. So they set up the Security Council, gave the 5 great powers veto power, and essentially set up a two-level organization in which the General Assembly, which votes on the big issues and includes everybody, doesn't really make the policy decisions like we're reading about even today and watching today with the crises in the world. The Security Council does that. The UN, though, was committed to not just trying to promote peace, but it was committed to the 4 freedoms. And next slide, please. And the key person, so there's UN headquarters in New York, the key person in advancing the cause of human rights after Roosevelt's death in the late 1940s at the UN was the US ambassador to the United Nations, perhaps the most influential woman in American politics in the 20th century, Eleanor Roosevelt. And there she is holding the finished document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this embodies basically all the things I think Americans and other people around the world think of as necessary for freedom. Political, economic, cultural freedom is stressed in this, and that was very controversial. People have a right to their own culture, and that is a human right that they have. And this continues to be a document to which groups who are in political activity in unfree places turn for inspiration and for legitimization of what they're doing. Next slide, please. So, how do you deal with what's happened and what will probably happen in new conflicts? International law, the laws of war, were not invented by what we call the Geneva Conventions. They have a long history, a history I actually wrote and talk about. They start with the first Geneva Convention, which sets up the International Committee of the Red Cross in 1864, after a Swiss businessman sees dead and wounded people suffering, people their bodies being looted, people being left to die, soldiers being left to die on a battlefield, Solferino in Europe. And he meets and they set up a committee to try to set up rules for how you treat wounded, prisoners, and the dead. And that's the first Geneva Convention. Then a global peace movement develops in the late 19th century that has 2 meetings, one in the late 1890s and another in the early 1900s. They set up what we call the laws of war. What is it legal to do in wartime? Well, it's legal to kill combatants. That's the main rule. It is illegal to kill non-combatants. And that's why in our news, there's so much controversy about what happens to the civilians in war zones. They're supposed to be not targeted, but this idea of collateral damage takes hold. That, oh, we're actually targeting this group of, I'll recall an incident that got me a lot of attention back in the Iraq War. In this building, there's snipers in this building shooting at our troops. How do we deal with it? The British would form up a small patrol, send them down the street into the building, try to find the place where the snipers are and capture or kill them. The Americans would shell it with artillery or bomb it to the ground, kill everybody in the building, okay? That was one of the things I found most objectionable about the Iraq War, actually, was this failure to respect the line between combatants and non-combatants. But this is very important. Obviously, after World War II, there's no concern for what happens once the bombing campaigns start. Everybody's a target, and sometimes it's even admitted. The bombing raid on Hamburg that killed 55,000 Germans in one night and made a couple 100,000 homeless was called a dehousing raid. Let's drive the workers out of Hamburg. That way they won't be able to make war munitions for the Germans. So we'll just destroy the neighborhoods in which they live. That kind of stuff gets worked up in the second Geneva Conventions, the new ones of 1949, and there's a couple of added ones to include civil wars and non-traditional warfare like wars on terror. But the whole point of it is to distinguish between killing combatants and non-combatants and trying to contain war in some kind of capsule of legal regulations. Next slide, please. So we get the Geneva Conventions, and then because of the work of this Polish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, who was in the UN constantly lobbying for a special international law, we get the Genocide Convention as well at the end of the 1940s. And he is the great hero of that political effort. He almost single-handedly brings about the Genocide Convention, which doesn't require what the Nazis do. It just requires killing a part of a group, intending to remove a group from its homeland, destroying not just the physical but the cultural identity of groups. That's the Genocide Convention, very much in discussion today, you know, in terms of what's going on in Gaza. Okay, next slide. And here are Eleanor and Franklin in statues at the wonderful National Historic Monument, the Roosevelt home in Hyde Park, New York. And they're rightly pictured together in this way because Eleanor and him were partners, although he was not a faithful husband right down to the end of his life. He was a partner with Eleanor in all the politics, and she, especially after he suffered his polio, is the one who's pushing him to get active, do more, get into politics. So it's really this kind of extraordinary team between the president and his wife, the First Lady. And they are very much responsible for the politics we're talking about tonight, the politics of ridding the world of fear. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to take it. Now we're doing the plumb line history. We've dropped it down to where do we start? Let's start with Roosevelt and his family, because he is the author of these thoughts and words. There he is with his mother, Anna. His mother lived with him most of his life. She lived in the White House until she died. Eleanor did not like the fact that she was always there, but she was. There he is in a little Scottish outfit. I had one in a dress, but I decided this would be better. There he is with his father, James. He comes from a patrician family, and I used to tell my students, probably the only working class people he ever met while he was young were servants, because he was a totally privileged existence. Next slide, please. Okay, so he marries his cousin, Delano Roosevelt, and she has money from the Delano family, which had made a fortune in the China trade in the 19th century. His family is well off, but they're not rich, and that becomes important in just a couple of minutes when I'm talking to you. There's their children, Anna and James. James becomes very important to Franklin Roosevelt because, as we'll see pictures of him apparently walking and standing, you'll almost always see James or some other large man, James turned into a big, strong guy, standing next to Roosevelt, holding him up, because if they didn't, he would just fall right over. Okay? Move on. Next slide. Okay, so Roosevelt has political ambitions as he gets older, graduates from prep school in Harvard, and he's elected from his district as a state senator, Democrat. That was pretty remarkable. It was a sign that he was somebody who could swing voters to the Democratic Party. He very much got behind the progressive era reforms that Woodrow Wilson was championing as what would be the platform for his party in the election of 1912. Next slide, please. So that Wilson wins the election, and New York goes for Wilson. Wilson rewards Roosevelt and brings him right into the administration. And this shows that at a very early age, he's a major figure in the Democratic Party. This is the past nominee and very famous Democrat, William Jennings Bryan. Right behind him, you can see the head of Josephus Daniels from North Carolina, that he was the Secretary of the Navy. There's the President, Woodrow Wilson. I'll skip this guy for a minute. I don't know who the next to last guy, that's Roosevelt standing there. This is Breckinridge Long, a classmate from Harvard, who would be in the State Department during the war and headed up the effort to prevent the United States from allowing Jewish refugees from the Holocaust to enter the United States, Breckinridge Long. And when Roosevelt found that out, he was outraged, and he, very late in the war, set up an effort to try to rescue some Jews. But for a very long time, that went nowhere, because the State Department was really a club filled with Ivy League anti-Semites, to be quite frank. I don't know if anybody from Dartmouth there. I hope not. I didn't want to insult Dartmouth. Okay, next slide. So as Secretary of the Navy, he is Assistant Secretary. He's also a very garrulous, fun person to be with. And obviously, Wilson enjoys his company. That's Daniels with him. Again, they're out sometime in 1915 on a porch talking. Next slide, please. But I want to point out an irony here. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Roosevelt takes charge of the Marine invasion of Haiti in 1915, after the president had been killed and there was unrest in Haiti. Still happens. And the United States invades and takes over Haiti and will stay there. So Roosevelt actually boasts of this achievement in the late 19-teens, that he was very much responsible for establishing order and getting things straight in Haiti. But in 1934, as president, rethinking relationships within this hemisphere around the Gulf, what I still want to call the Gulf of Mexico, and in Latin America, announced a good neighbor policy. And to make people realize he meant it, he withdrew the troops from Haiti. Okay, so this is a turning point from a history of imperialism and seizing colonies in the Caribbean, in East Asia, and in Panama, to some kind of different relationship in which the United States would act as a good neighbor. Okay, next slide. As Assistant Secretary of the Navy, late in the war, 1918, Roosevelt sees what World War I looks like. And I think this is very important. It was very important to Churchill, too, because after Churchill left the ministries, Churchill actually served as an infantry colonel at the front in World War I. Roosevelt tours the front. He's at the French fort of Verdun in 1918. He tours the Western Front, and he sees what the war was. And he sees how modern technology had changed the war story profoundly. It begins to change in the direction of soldiers are great heroes who go out and do wonderful things, daring, brave, amazing feats. They save people. They save themselves. They might sacrifice themselves for others. But increasingly, beginning with World War I, and this is our lifetime, the pictures of soldiers in war are often of victims. And especially after the use of poison gas, soldiers increasingly appear as victims, not these heroic figures. And this is a very important thing in peace history, the changing story of war. What is the archetypal war story of our time? Is it that slaughter we see on the TV every morning? Or is it some brave soldier doing some remarkable military feat? I think it's more the other. Okay, another slide. All right, so Roosevelt he's such a good speaker, and he's got so much vim and vigor. Notice him. He's nominated as the vice presidential candidate to run with James Cox. You all know Wilson had a stroke during his last year. His wife was basically the president of the United States. He could not run. And the Ohio governor, James Cox, is nominated and would lose to the Ohio senator, Warren Harding, very badly. A huge defeat, actually, in this. Cox and Roosevelt only got 26% of the popular vote in 1920. And that might have doomed his political career, and nothing else happened. But I wanted to show this slide in particular because they're walking down a street in Dayton, Ohio, and waving to the crowd. Next slide, please. Here's a picture from the campaign of 1932. Notice the difference. Look at Roosevelt's legs. They are out straight like this. They're inside braces. He cannot walk. He cannot stand up on his own. He can't support his own weight. He has to be lifted out of a car. But he's projecting confidence, happiness, positivity at this worst moment of the Great Depression, and it was a terrible moment. In my book on the Great Depression, New Deal, I had to argue with the publishers because they said, you're spending too much time on the 1930 to 1933. I said, no, I'm not, because the crisis is much greater than it's usually depicted. Tremendous racial violence, riots, armed groups of whites and blacks fighting each other, tens of thousands of unemployed people taking over public buildings, the National Guard rooting them out of the buildings in Salt Lake City, of all places, huge protest march, anti-eviction riots, and then the collapse of the banks, literally the collapse of the bank, when the New York Federal Reserve says to the Chicago Federal Reserve, no, we can't send you any money reserves because we don't have any either. That was the very end of that crisis, but it was a tremendous crisis. And he's projecting an optimistic way out of it, even though he can't walk. Okay, next slide. He would be crippled by polio for the rest of his life. And this is a picture of the braces that he had to put on his legs if he wanted to appear in public. And they were rigid, they locked at the knees so he could stand up. He had a special wheelchair made that the public almost never saw, that didn't look so much like a normal wheelchair. And this is a rare picture of it. I'm not sure what year that came from, but I wanted to show it. Because as far as most of the public knew, he was not a cripple. They never saw him crippled. Okay, next slide. All right, now this is his comeback. He was stricken by polio after visiting a Boy Scout camp on Campobello Island where his family had a summer place, and it's now a national park, international park actually, because it's an international island. And he is completely down and out and despairing. It's Eleanor who gives him strength to try to start reviving himself and working his body. And once he starts, he never gives up the effort. Right to the end of his life, he's looking for new exercises, new ways to work, to build up his body, and still hoping to walk. But this is his return to politics. 1924 Democratic Convention, July of that year. Here he is at the podium nominating Al Smith. And I want you to notice, it's a little fuzzy in the photograph, that he's standing at the podium, both hands locked on the sides of the podium, because if they weren't, he would fall right over, okay? But this is one of the three ways he appears in public frequently and appears to be, as one of his butlers once said, he appears to be a whole man, even though he's actually only half a man, as this guy put it. Okay, and then there he is. A few years later, Al Smith's been nominated twice, doesn't get nominated in 24 actually. It's the convention that goes 103 ballots. Gets nominated in 28, loses. Roosevelt takes his place as governor of New York. Al Smith welcoming Roosevelt in a chair as governor of New York to the State House or to the governor's office in Albany. Okay, next slide. All right, so we see Roosevelt in different pictures in rural Georgia here. Eleanor had money in her family. Roosevelt had heard about this rundown spa in Warm Springs, Georgia, and had been reading about how warm water, salt, mineral water and pool would help him with his polio. He convinced her to put money into a polio treatment and recovery center at Warm Springs, and he spent enormous amounts of time there right after polio for the next couple of years, but frequently visiting it. And this is crucially important. This is when he meets a cross-section of Americas, because they offer scholarships, and people come, many of them from poor, working class, middle class backgrounds, white and some blacks. They come to Warm Springs. Roosevelt hangs out in the pool with them, eats with them, meets them, hears from them what kind of lives they have. He also has cars specially outfitted so he can drive. He loved cars. One of the reasons they built so many nice roads. When I go visit my son in Beacon, New York, from northern New York, we take the Taconic Parkway, because it is literally a road through a park, and it is beautiful. And Roosevelt loved to drive, and here he is meeting some farmers in rural Georgia during the campaign of 1932, leaning out the window. You have lots of pictures of him leaning out a car window, because he's now a mobile man, so he can hold himself up and he can move around in a car, and that's really important to him. So there are incremental steps that he's taking to overcome the polio. One other thing I don't have a good slide on, but I wanted to mention is Eleanor keeps bringing people for him to spend time with, because he has lots of time on his hands while he's recovering. And the people that she brings, most importantly, are women trade union leaders from the Women's Trade Union League in New York City. Rose Schneiderman was one, Maud Schwartz was another one. They were people who had formed these powerful organizations. You might have heard of it, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, early 20th century New York City, where scores of young female workers were killed. And they hang out with him up in Hyde Park and talk to him. And so when I was trying to figure out how does Roosevelt become this great humanitarian, without having, starting where we started, without knowing any real other people than his own class, it's this polio experience that creates in Roosevelt his humanity. And that's what I want to emphasize, that what we hear in the Four Freedoms is humanity as it's thought of and phrased and envisioned by Franklin Roosevelt. Next slide, please. So another campaign from the world. Here he is with Anna, his daughter, and his wife. And you'll notice, one of the first things I learned when I was studying, I actually studied a lot of English history, was look at the hats of the men. It'll tell you what class they're from. So you can see here that this is a multi-class gathering around Roosevelt. Tremendously popular. Obviously, next slide, please. This guy was not at that point in time. Herbert Hoover, who had an amazing career, was because he headed up the American food relief program in Europe, which was really the European food relief program for the most part. After World War I, he was known as the great humanitarian. But he had never been elected to any other office but the presidency of his fraternity at Stanford. He had a professional career as an international engineer, and then he moved into government positions out of his relief work. But they ride together into the inauguration, where Roosevelt uses these famous words, the only thing we have to fear is silence. That was a complete lie, but great, great politics. Roosevelt knew they had everything. They had race war, they had the financial collapse, the collapse of markets, prices. Adolph Burley, who was one of his brains trusts, did a special study of unemployment. I got in big arguments with economists. There were no unemployment statistics because they weren't important. Unemployed people were not important to the federal government. They started taking surveys in the 30s after he takes office, but he says these words as he's being inaugurated. He knew there was plenty to fear. But one of the things it does is it gives historians a bad cue, really. This is a psychological crisis. All he had to do was kind of magically change the mood in the country, and we would recover. And he didn't actually think that, but his words alone were enough to start to change. And then it's the creation of big, federally run organizations. Next slide, please. The New Deal, that brings about what most of us, if we were living there, would have recognized as a fairly healthy economy. Because if you worked for the federal government in the work relief programs, you're still counted as unemployed, even though tens of millions of people are doing things like Civilian Conservation Corps, conservation work. This is actually Public Works Administration, building amazing structures all over the place. This is the Fort Peck Dam in Montana going up. If you've ever seen it, an incredible dam. And then by 1935, trying to regularize the system, setting up a system of Social Security. So by the end of the 30s, Social Security is the main theme in the New Deal. We are going to make every American secure in their homes and in their families. And then we get the war coming on, and there's going to be a gradual shift to national security. And to this day, in the great, big, beautiful bill, you can see spelled out how that goes over the long term. How much goes to military spending, secret intelligence agencies and the like, and how much goes into programs especially designed for poorer Americans. There's a real different priority once the war starts, and it will take over our national budget. Okay, next. Okay, so the war begins actually in 1935. Can we say that? Perhaps even earlier, the Mukden confrontation between Japanese and Chinese troops in northern Manchuria was 31, but the war in China not full-blown at that point. This is actually Italian troops in their invasion of Ethiopia, and they're taking over. And all of East Africa, that northern part of East Africa, by 1940 are Italian colonies. This is the bombing of Shanghai in 1937, when Roosevelt goes on and makes his first really clear statement about what was going on in the war. And he said, we have to quarantine, famous words, Chicago speech, quarantine the aggressors. What he meant by that was unclear. What he did about it was not much. But that's a step toward more engagement. This, of course, is the beginning of the war, as it's often calculated. 1939, German troops moving into Poland. This, and this part of that same war, moving into Poland. This is part we forget, because just before that war began, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, and this is Russian troops invading Poland right here. So you have this incredible war stretching the globe. Remember, there's navies out there, there's colonies to attack. These are still empires fighting. In fact, that's one of the remarkable things about where we're at right now. We entered a stage of human history where empire is illegitimate, where countries are not supposed to pursue empire. We're not supposed to grab Greenland or Panama or someplace like that. That every country is supposed to be secure within its own borders. But this was clearly not the case in 1939. Okay, next slide. So Roosevelt had to go through this, and they consider this, most historians of Roosevelt consider this his second great achievement, equal to his response to the Great Depression. How could we overcome American neutrality? Because there was this idea that the entrance into World War I was a complete failure, a waste of lives and treasure. We should never do it again. So what the group called, we would call them in our time, the isolationists in Congress, very powerful, passed laws, 1935, 36, 37, barring the United States from giving loans to any countries at war, providing war materials to any countries at war, to doing any trade with countries at war. So very strict neutrality by end of 1937. How does Roosevelt get aid to the Allies? He has to figure out ways to get around that. And he does this in a series of steps, some of which were extremely controversial at the time. And excuse me for a minute, I've got to get myself on target here. So he begins by saying, he proposes a law, revision of the Neutrality Act. If countries pay for what they want and buy from us, they can carry it away themselves. That's called the Cash and Carry Act. Then, using executive powers, not legislation, because Congress would have never approved it, he works out a deal with Britain to trade 50 older American destroyers for leases, 90-year leases on British bases in their colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And this is a picture of American soldiers showing British sailors how to use some equipment that's secret and they don't have on their ships. And then lastly, he will campaign in Congress for the Lend-Lease Act, which has, again, a kind of bogus name, because if you lend a country war materials, they're not going to return them when they're done with them. They're gone. They're gone, right? So it's basically, okay, almost all aid without stop for the beleaguered. At that point in time, we're talking about the beleaguered British. And actually, Roosevelt takes that action after he gets a telegram from Winston Churchill saying, we will be bankrupt and unable to get anything from the United States unless you change the terms of this arrangement. And Roosevelt responds with Lend-Lease. Okay, next slide. How am I doing on time here? Oh, I'm all right. Okay, so this brings us to the election of 1940, just before the For Freedom speech. The Republicans know that if they were to put up somebody like Charles Lindbergh, leader of the American First Organization, who's been praising Hitler, has gotten an award from Hitler, says that, the United States can be a fortress unto itself. We should not, and importantly, this is the really important intellectual, we should not break with the policy of Washington, which is don't get entangled in European wars. Wilson did, we saw the results, we should not do it. That was the main I would say the majority opinion of Americans, even as late as mid-1940. The Republicans put up this guy who had never run for office, Wendell Willkie, an international New York lawyer, who essentially agrees that we cannot allow the fascists and the Japanese to win, but he doesn't have any policies that stand starkly against Roosevelt. In fact, he endorses several of Roosevelt's policies. Here's Roosevelt giving his final speech in a packed auditorium in Cleveland. And a lot of the effort to defeat him is aimed at breaking the third-party precedent. Of course, there was no law, there's now a constitutional amendment against running for a third term or serving for a third term. But Roosevelt felt like there was just nobody else who could carry this forward. Having taken it this far, he campaigned on a slogan, let's finish the job, which he would do again in 1944 when he shouldn't probably have run because his health had just about collapsed at that point. But they get reelected, not by the huge margins of 1936, which were amazing. Next slide, please. And there was fewer than 100 Republicans in the House and just a couple of score Republicans in the Senate at that time. He goes and he declares that the United States will now be, I'm elected, I'm changing the other policies. We must be the great arsenal of democracy, a famous way of looking at the United States. From America, they will get ships, they need planes. From America, they will get planes. They need food. From America, they will get food. They need tanks and guns and ammunition and supplies of all kinds from America. They will get tanks, guns, ammunition, and supplies of all kinds. Our country is going to be what our people have proclaimed it must be, the arsenal of democracy. Our country is going to play the full part, okay? A few days later, he is going to be explaining that to what the war is going to be about in the speech to Congress on the 6th of January 1941. Next slide, please. And so now we're beginning to get into what does it lead to at that time. And it leads immediately to the meeting of Roosevelt and Churchill on the decks of warships at a British base leased to the United States in Newfoundland. And they proclaim what's known as the Atlantic Charter, which has within it a large part of the four freedoms. Here's Roosevelt welcoming Churchill on board. That's his son James. Notice how they're standing. James is supporting Roosevelt's weight. Here they are in a ceremony on the deck of the British ship and sitting together. And Churchill, who famously said, "I did not become Prime Minister to see the dissolution of the British Empire." He loved the British Empire. He had been a soldier in it in India and Afghanistan in the 19th century. He loved the British Empire. But he knew he had to give way, at least rhetorically, and in other ways too, perhaps, but really rhetorically at this meeting in Newfoundland. So the Atlantic Charter declares that the Allies will seek no territorial gains, okay? This is not a war between empires to seize parts of enemy empires. That territorial changes, if there are any, have to be approved by local people. How radical is that when you think about where the British Empire is at that time? All over the world, Latin America, Africa, Asia, everywhere, North America. He says, all people have a right to self-determination. So in other words, that's a principle in a sense from the Declaration of Independence. Economic cooperation to promote the advance of global social welfare. We want to work for a world free of want and fear, direct words from the four freedoms. Freedom of the seas, the old Wilsonian aim, and then still love to see it, but disarmament of aggressor nations immediately, okay, when they're defeated, and then general disarmament to follow. So the Atlantic Charter is an extremely ambitious outline of foreign policy for the United States and Britain after the war. One it will try to follow, but history gets more complicated as we get further into the war and into the post-war. Okay, next. So now the United States is ready for war. It's the arsenal of democracy. The Office of War Production has been set up. The Office of Price Management to control prices and wartime inflation has been set up. All kinds of new agencies have been set up. But Congress is not ready to declare war on Germany. The Japanese start the war, our role in the war with the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th. That's the USS Shaw blowing up in Pearl Harbor on December 7th. And this leads Roosevelt on December 8th to go to Congress to declare war on Japan because of that day of infamy. And at the very same time, Adolf Hitler, in one of his almost inexplicable strategic moves, but he is an ally of Japan in the Axis, declares war on the United States. And that saves Roosevelt the trouble of making a political argument for a two-front war on opposite sides of the world. And it's very important. Roosevelt immediately says, we're going to defeat Hitler first, then we'll defeat Japan. That was the priorities he set. Okay, next. So we go to war, and all across America during the war, you'd see these kind of posters. And notice, why are we at war? Mainland United States is still secure because we want the four freedoms. We're trying to change the world. And here's what's, I want to emphasize this, I can't emphasize this enough. Everywhere in the world, for everyone. That is such a radical break with world history, that everyone in the world has the right to the four freedoms, and everyone in the world are the people we are fighting for everywhere. Black, brown, Asian, Native American, everybody. We're fighting for everybody to have freedom in this sense. And that's the sense in which this is the foundation of American modern liberalism, that it is now saying that everyone's included. I had trouble with the cover of my book. I didn't want to publicize myself on the New Deal because I chose a picture that Ben Shahn had painted of Roosevelt being hailed by people of all colors. And the CIO PAC, that's Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was the main source of funding. Business did not fund Roosevelt at all. For Roosevelt in the campaign of 1944, chose that as one of their campaign posters and put a sign on it, put words on it, "Our friend." And when I chose that as the cover for my book, they left the "Our friend" on it. So initially, a lot of people thought the title of the book was "Our friend," which it really wasn't. It was America's response to the New Deal, or to the Great Depression. Okay, next. So here's what people began to see. Norman Rockwell moved from New Rochelle, New York to Arlington, Vermont, a few miles from where I live, actually. And in 1942, after thinking about what he had seen at the town meeting in Arlington, Vermont, he started these 4 paintings. It took him 7 months to complete them, so nearly to the end of 1942. And each one of them appeared separately as a cover on the Saturday Evening Post, a set of 4 covers. It's probably the most famous set of covers the Saturday Evening Post, an extremely popular magazine at the time, had. And take a look at it. I mean, it's Arlington, Vermont. These are actually Norman Rockwell's neighbors and people he knew in that little town back there in 1942. And one of the things that critics of this would say later on is, well, if this is America, where are the other people? Where are the people who don't look like they're descended from, New England Puritans? And yet, there's something very moving about these pictures and the way they inspire a sense of dedication to the cause. That this is what we're actually fighting for. We're fighting so that people can have good meals on their table, so their kids can go to sleep at night feeling free, so people can worship however they want. And of course, people can get up, speak their mind, and have a role in political life. Okay, next. We're getting there. I'm getting there. So the war ends in Europe, and of course, Hitler famously said Europe is a charnel house. It's hard for us to imagine how much destruction there was. This is Berlin after American, Russian, and British bombing raids. I mean, look at that city. We see stuff like this on the news now, actually. Ukraine, Gaza. These are, and if you could see this picture carefully, they're mostly women. These are Russian women seized by the Nazis to do slave labor work in war materials factories in Germany, being freed by a French army. Okay, next slide, please. And then, of course, there is the uncovering, the photographing of the new, and remember one thing, I haven't even mentioned it. This is not a pre-media age. One of the reasons Roosevelt's so successful is that he uses the radio so well with the fireside chats, right? He talks to my friends, and he sounds like a friend. But also, there are the newsreels. The movies change 2 or 3 times a week, and the newsreel companies would bring in new newsreels. And so you would get video and commentary like we get on a television news all through the war and afterwards. But these pictures were not shown until after the war. And when only obviously, some of them could be. So we have different depictions here of children freed from a camp in Poland, gathered at the gate, the wires waiting to be released. One of the 3 mass burial pits at Bergen-Belsen, Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, freed by the Americans. This is what most Americans would see when they went to the newsreels. Film of that freeing, and then more women freed in Poland by a Polish Free Army group from a concentration camp. We tend to want to see the survivors because they remind us that there is survival. But the reality is there's millions and millions of others who didn't survive. And it does seem to create, and this was Lemkin in the UN, now we're talking about, you can't deny that this has happened. He was originally, the Armenian genocide in World War I was what triggered his initial political activities. And this is really what pushes the Genocide Convention, to its ratification. Okay, next. So here we go. Now it gets trickier. War's End in Japan. That's a little boy there. The atomic bomb, U-236 bomb. One of the lectures my MIT, I taught at MIT for a few years, they liked the best was when I got real technical. So I got into the technicalities of the atomic bombs and the differences between them. So this is what little boy did to Hiroshima, which is a city on a flat plain. A bomb by standards just a few years later, a small bomb. But look at it, even compared to Berlin, it's gone. There's nothing there, okay? So nuclear fear is born. Nuclear fear. It's always with us. Often we don't even realize it, but it's always with us. It's the context of our world that we have created as a result of World War II. It's a way of thinking that says what we people, what we Homo sapiens are doing on this earth is going to kill us all. We're going to kill ourselves. We're going to make ourselves dead forever. We're going to be extinct. And that kind of fear, I think, culturally, I've written about some of this stuff, starts to spread into other areas. I think the way we conceive of what climate change might do is greatly influenced by nuclear fear. Okay, next slide. Is this still our fate? You know, there was tremendous buildup of nuclear weapons. Once the Russians exploded their hydrogen bomb in 1949, it was just build, 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 build. So there's over 50,000 nuclear weapons in the world in 1965, enough to wipe out this world and probably every planet in the solar system. It's crazy. They try to, you know, can we build a defense? Anti-ballistic missile defense. Remember that one? They signed a treaty, and they're realizing, well, then the other side will do the same thing, and we won't get anywhere, and then we'll do it tit for tat, tit for tat. We just keep new bombs, new delivery systems. We'll deliver them from subs. We'll deliver them from missiles. We'll deliver them from airplanes, right? The triad. We'll make sure we deliver them, though, when they're needed. So there's this, and then there's a sort of a scaling back in the 60s, at least a leveling out. And then there's a new buildup when Reagan comes into office. The multiple intercontinental ballistic re-entry vehicles, missiles that would carry perhaps 20 or 30 atomic bombs or nuclear bombs into this outer space. And then as they re-enter through the stratosphere, they would open up and they would spread out and go everywhere. And when Gorbachev and Reagan meet, two men with some humanity, they realize, this is insane. What are we doing this for? That leads to successful nuclear reductions that go on into this century, getting it down into just a few thousand nuclear weapons from over 50,000. But now we're on another upswing, and now we're going to build not the Star Wars that Reagan had hoped, but they, you know, once they start scaling down, Star Wars disappears. the Golden Dome. Maybe this will be the one that will allow us to do that to our enemies, but not allow them to do that to us. Okay, next slide. So does it make it safer? Or does it require us to continually pour the bulk, the great bulk of discretionary federal spending into military spending, and a large part of it into nuclear spending? By 1995, the United States had spent $6 trillion on nuclear weapons alone. $6 trillion. That's, remember, a billion is 1,000 million. What billionaire needs more than 1,000 million? Who knows? We know who they are. But a trillion is 1,000 billions, all right? So $6,000 billion spent on nuclear weapons by 1995. What are using the economics term, some of you know, what are the opportunities of taking $6 trillion out of the revenue stream, putting in nuclear weapons? What aren't we doing? Might there have been flood control in that valley in Texas if we had taken a small share of it and put it there? You know? So that we get into, because of the Cold War, a situation where it becomes extremely difficult to achieve the four freedoms, and for me, the one that I'm talking about most is freedom from fear, because we continually build these fear-filled weapon systems. Okay, next. So what we got to work for is peace, you know? And my study of peace history tells us the only way we get there is in movements. So it's very encouraging to me to see that every week, almost every day now, Americans are on the streets exercising their freedom of speech and expression, telling people that we need to find another way to go forward if we are going to have a peaceful world for our children, our grandchildren, their grandchildren, and so forth. This is actually the peace sign. Anybody? I was supposed to ask questions. It's actually a semaphore for nuclear disarmament. The V is an N and the straight line is a D. It's in a circle. British artist Gerald Holton designed it in 1958 for the first British anti-nuclear movement, the European nuclear disarmament movement, and it becomes a global sign that you see it everywhere around the world now. And of course, it does evoke, to me, it always has, a bomber as well inside the circle. Okay. So how do we do this? Words are important, very important, in fact. Words might give us a map to peace. Rather than starting the lecture with this hopeful poem I'm going to read you, I'll end it because it's a beautiful poem. I used to read it to all my peace history classes. It's called Making Peace. It's by Denise Levertov. A voice from the dark called out, "The poets must give us imagination of peace to oust the intense, familiar imagination of disaster. Peace, not only the absence of war, but peace, like a poem, is not there ahead of itself, can't be imagined before it's made, can't be known except in the words of its making, grammar of justice, syntax of mutual aid. A feeling towards it, a dimly sensing rhythm is all we have until we begin to utter its metaphors, learning them as we speak. A line of peace might appear if we restructured the sentence our lives are making, revoked its reaffirmation of profit and power, questioned our needs, allowed long pauses. A cadence of peace might balance its weight on that different fulcrum. Peace, a presence and energy field, more intense than war, might pulse then, stanza by stanza, into the world, each act of living, one of its words, each word a vibration of light, facets of the forming crystal. Peace. Thank you. Put your questions for me in this bucket here. Is there one in the back? No. So this bucket up here, you're going to have to drop them in. If you're out there in Zoom land, send them to us, and we're going to go over them in the next half hour, and I'll come back out, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. Thank you very much.
Welcome back, everyone. For those of you that don't know who I am, I'm Osher, Lisa King, director with Osher at Dartmouth. First, want to thank both Ron Edsforth and Jean Garthright. Right after I make a little announcement, we'll carry on with the Q&A, but I wanted to share something with you that I'm very excited about and wanted this is a perfect stage with those online and here in person. We are honored to share some truly exciting news with Osher at Dartmouth community. We are proud to announce the creation of the William C. Scott Humanities Distinguished Research Professor and Family Fund. One of our most beloved and dedicated study leaders, William C. Scott, known to many of you as Bill, left an indelible mark on our program through his years of inspired teaching and unwavering passion for the classics. Bill's courses brought to life timeless works such as the Iliad, the Odyssey, Greek tragedy, the lyric poetry of Sappho, just to name a few. His students were consistently moved by his deep knowledge, enthusiasm, and generosity as a teacher. Bill's commitment to lifelong learning and the Osher Institute was extraordinary, and his contributions have helped shape our program into what it is today. In recognition of his lasting impact and in heartfelt tribute to his many years of teaching, Bill's wife, Mary Lyon Scott, and their family have established this legacy fund in Bill's honor. This meaningful gift is the first fund ever in the history of our program established by an Osher member and their family to support the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Dartmouth. It will help meet vital program needs and further our mission for the years to come. The fund stands as a lasting testament to Bill's passion for the humanities and his commitment to lifelong education and the love for our community. We extend our deepest heartfelt appreciation to Mary Lyon Scott and the entire Scott family for this extraordinary and generous gift. It's a powerful tribute to a remarkable teacher and ensures Bill's legacy will continue to inspire and enrich learners for generations to come. Thank you, and Jean, I'll turn it over to you and Ron.
There's some terrific questions and way too many to be dealt with. And I want to begin with the first, which could also be the last question, because it leads to the future lectures in this series. And this is from Steve at Osher UVA. Please comment on the impact of the Big Beautiful Bill on FDR's Four Freedoms. A general comment of the Four Freedoms, which is most impacted.
Okay, I'm a little leery about getting too deep into current political commentary, except to say that the Big Beautiful Bill is really a reversal of what the Roosevelt Democratic Party was trying to achieve. You could start with the taxation policy, and I know we have a question on taxation in there. I saw it when we were reviewing them. Roosevelt believed in taxing those who had the most and using the money to help those who had the least. And the highest marginal tax rates were raised throughout the New Deal, and then when the war began, they were raised even further. Roosevelt wanted a 100% tax on incomes over $200,000. He got 90% from the Congress. And those tax rates persisted. They may have been a little revised for inflation, but those tax rates were preserved until the Kennedy tax cuts of the early 60s. So in this period when the United States is remembered as having this great post-war prosperity, building a middle class, building the new auto suburbs, building the America we all know, the richest people were paying this very high tax. And they played an instrumental role in funding it because the federal government was putting this money into the programs, and some of it, you know, very basic infrastructure, interstate highways, completion of the TVA, the flood control dams all through the West, hydroelectric power all through the West. Remember, up until 1950, most Americans did not have electricity if they lived outside of a town. And that job of bringing on the lights, I have wonderful stories of when the lights first come on in certain places. It's like they enter the 20th century for the first time when the power comes. And that's all due to the rural electrification administration of the Roosevelt administration. So first on taxes, that would be the first thing. Secondly, the Roosevelt budget during the war obviously was geared to winning the war, so a tremendous amount of military spending. But the overall structure of the Roosevelt New Deal was to ensure that Social Security would have its own independent stream of taxes. That's why when people tell you federal spending is going to Social Security and Medicare, the taxes that you pay out of your payroll taxes, they're misleading you, because those are designated tax funds. They're not from the general income tax or corporate tax revenues. That's discretionary spending. That's what's decided by the Congress, okay? And should be decided by the Congress in serious debate. But the Social Security that Congress can change, they could save Social Security in a day if they just raised the cap on incomes susceptible to Social Security taxation. They would save Social Security for as many decades as they wanted, really. But the discretionary budget has been more or less continuously about 35 to 40% military and national security spending, and everything else that's left over for all the other programs. The big, beautiful bill is cutting a lot of those programs. The one that had disturbed me most when I first saw it was completely eliminating AID, American International Development Fund. This has been critical throughout the world for decades in bringing places that were, for want of a better word, had not really entered the modern world, beginning to bring them into the modern world, to providing necessary food and water in times of emergency. It's completely eliminated. Freedom, so it's a bill that increases want. It's a bill that increases fear. It's a bill that it's an administration that increasingly is attacking freedom of speech and expression, troops on the streets to prevent peaceful demonstrators from exercising those freedoms. And it's a bill that really is in a way afraid to deal with freedom of religion because there's such an anti-Muslim bias in the administration and in its active policies that it's discouraging certain religions over others. And clearly within the Trump movement, there's a very large contingent of people who have this historically erroneous idea that somehow we are a Christian republic, whereas the Constitution makes it clear we are a republic with no official religion. And that is because all those people back then in the 18th century working that Constitution up realized that the history of Europe that they knew was one of tremendously destructive wars between religious groups. Just in our break, I told Gene one of the big books I had never read was Wedgwood's 30-Year War, a 600-page narrative of the 30 Years' War. Wiped out 1/3 of the European population, a war between Protestants and Catholics. And we know those things continue. I was in England studying during the IRA bombing attacks in England and was actually in a city that had a bombing attack back in the 1970s. Religious divisions promote war. Take away official approval of a religion, let everyone worship in the manner that their conscience, the words of the Four Freedom, where their conscience takes them. And you have a much stronger basis for creating a free society where people recognize one another for who they are in their culture, and that includes their religion.
This actually leads to two questions, one from the group here and one from Mary, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. What led Roosevelt to include freedom of religion in the Four Freedoms, and how did FDR advance the freedom of religion?
Well, I think what led him to it is that he had always believed in it. And that I also think that he showed it in his appointments. Roosevelt appointed more Catholics and more Jews to high positions in his administration than any previous president, and probably a whole collection of previous presidents. So I think that is a major reason why he included it. And I think he recognized in the country there was a tremendous, at that time, tremendous degree of anti-Semitism. I'll go off on a tangent that I wasn't able to before. And I know we got a question about Breckinridge Long, so I'll answer that one too, because it's part of it. The United States government's policy was try to ignore and suppress news of the Holocaust. But in the 30s, when Jews began to leave, there was an effort to change the immigration laws. The very restrictive racial, religious, they were really racially based, regional or country-based restrictions in immigration acts of 1924 and 29. They set up a quota system where if you were from Northwest European countries, the quota would never be filled. If you were from any place else in Europe, the quota would be overdrawn, and the rest of the world had no quota, basically. Oceania, Asia, Africa, they had quotas of 100 a year, okay? Trying to bring in more Jews from Europe after 1935, as they began to flee in greater numbers, like with the famous ship that comes over and is turned back, would have required changing the law and changing the quotas. The Jewish congressman from Brooklyn, whose name just slipped out of my mind, was the head of the Immigration Committee, a friend of Roosevelt's. He went to the White House and said, "Mr. President, don't try to change the quotas. If we do, they, meaning the representatives principally of the South and the West, they will lower them. They will make them zero." And so Roosevelt didn't do it. I had a wonderful student who worked on this subject, actually got his work published in a prominent magazine following what happened. And his whole life, he had grown up in a Jewish family and wondered why we had not rescued more, and he decided to really hone in on it. And he found out this group of people in the State Department were suppressing it. This Treasury official, John Peel, put together a little task force, and they gathered the documents, and then they, with the help of the Treasury Secretary, who himself was Jewish, Henry Morgenthau, they bring this material to Roosevelt in early '44, and they show him, and he looks at it, he reads it, and he says, "What do you want me to do?" And they say, "Set up a program to rescue Jews," which was the War Refugee Board that did get set up. But that was the reason why, and I think he was appalled by that time in his life, by the time he had become president, probably even much earlier, he was appalled by the anti-Semitism he encountered. Remember, Rose Schneiderman and Maud Schwartz and some of these other women that Eleanor were bringing out of the trade union league, they were all Jewish working class women. And he knew them. I mean, the point here is he knew them as human beings. He looked in their eyes, they looked in their eyes, and they saw human beings. And he abhorred that kind of anti-Semitism and really believed the only solution was the Founding Fathers' solution was no established religion. none at all. And remember, we didn't even add "In God We Trust" to the currency stuff until 1952. It's a Cold War edition. It didn't exist before then. Next question.
These are two that are related. One is from UVA and one is from Wendy at the University of Michigan, and deal with the question of executive power. Compare and contrast FDR and DJT's concept and use of executive power. And then the other one is Roosevelt seems all-powerful and exercised a great deal of executive power. What role does Congress have in all of the four freedoms?
Okay. The last part I'm not sure I can answer well. But yes, Roosevelt really used more executive orders than any previous president. And Trump is doing the same. In that sense, there is a parallel. Roosevelt was in an emergency when he did this, especially in the early Great Depression, and then again at the time I just lectured about, where he knew action had to happen quickly or there would be further suffering and further problems to deal with down the road. So he did use, he was roundly denounced as a dictator by the Republican leadership, by the Republican Party, by other people all through the country. I used to sign a short pamphlet, really about 40 pages, by Marcus Childs called "They Hate Roosevelt." And he had been going to dinner parties and gatherings of wealthy Republicans and other Republicans. And all around, he would hear things like, "I wish somebody would kill him. We need to get rid of him. He's a dictator." And so he published this piece, wonderful piece for Student Street, "They Hate Roosevelt." They did hate him. They really did hate him. And for reasons perhaps, that they're not the same, but they're parallel to reasons why I think quite a few Americans right now probably hate the president right now for what he's doing. They see him as abusing power to do things that they didn't want done. Roosevelt did do that. So I would say there is a real parallel there. He did take advantage of executive power. Congress is supposed to have more power than it's been showing lately. The one that gets me is tariffs. Tariff power, it lies with the Congress. Virtually every session of Congress in the 19th and 20th century up to our time, when free trade comes in, there would be a long debate over the tariff schedule. They would debate every single product and what the tariffs would be on them. And the regional groups would form and so forth. And it would generally divide. Democrats would prefer low tariffs. Republicans preferred high tariffs. They had that power. Somehow that has disappeared. And now we have a president, and this is way beyond Roosevelt, and not just because of the ability to use a phone and tweet, who changes the tariff policy almost day by day. And that creates a degree of uncertainty that certainly inhibits long-term investment and may be more dangerous than that. But I do think that there is a parallel in the use of executive power, but not in the reasons for which it's used.
This is a bit of a change, Carol, from UVA, and it deals with Roosevelt as a politician. What lessons can current leaders learn from Roosevelt to win over voters?
Okay, wow. Maybe I should save this one if I'm going to become an advisor in the next campaign. I think a major thing that they could learn was embrace the term working class and working people. Stop talking about the middle class and start talking about people who work for a living and have to support themselves and their family and their future on the paychecks they take home. I think that's extremely important. And I think that's what a lot of the voters, particularly in this last election, young male voters, did not hear, that they did not hear identified. If you're asked to identify yourself, Do you identify yourself as middle class as the first identifier? Isn't it ethnicity? Is it religion? Is it some family connection? Is it where you're from? Is it some cultural phenomenon? But is it middle class? And this is what I wrote a lot about in my young days when I focused on the automobile. Middle class is an imagined place. It's the place where corporate advertising wants you to go. They want you to buy the next new thing. The American automobile industry pioneered this. The first big advertising campaign, national, was the big General Motors and others. The automobile is your freedom machine. You have a new kind of freedom. The automobile provides you this way to get to the suburbs, where you now can have this bigger place to live, filled with all these amazing technologies. And there's always a next new thing. They want to sell you this today, but you know there's a next new thing tomorrow and a next new thing. And so you're in this competition. Actually, de Tocqueville recognized this when he visited America in the 1830s, that Americans comparing each other to farmers, they looking at each other's farms and saying, what do we got to get to be a respectable farmer? And it's, what do we have to be a respectable person? Now, you know, it's more and more and more. And so even though you're living at a living standard that people 50, 100 years ago would have thought amazing, they still feel like they don't have the opportunity to get the next new things they need. And I think that's really important to kind of move away from the emphasis on that identity and talk about what people are working hard at and talk about the rewards they get, talk about the security they need, talk about the fact that healthcare has gotten so expensive and we have to do something to make it more affordable for everybody. That's, I think, enough on that one.
Here's Donna for a local. How did Roosevelt justify staying out of World War II as long as he did?
He had no choice. Congress has the power to declare war. We forget that in our lifetime because the president now seems to have the power to start wars. And supposedly under the War Powers Act, 60 days later, the Congress has to approve or tell them to stop. But it was because Congress had to approve with the declaration of war. And remember, Congress and the country was really what, I don't like the term, but really was isolationist. They believed, in a sense rightly, that the United States was secure as a country in the Western Hemisphere and would remain secure, that it was impossible, Roosevelt said this on a number of occasions, it was impossible for the Japanese or the Germans to land invasion forces on either the East or West Coast and conquer America. It couldn't be done, and they wouldn't try to do it. So he is linking our national security to the security of all these other countries on the other side of the world. But the reason, he had to overcome it. So I did it in the lecture, that step-by-step process, beginning with the quarantine speech, of getting the American public and people in Congress ready to go the next step, the next step, the next step. It's not clear if the Japanese hadn't bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, whether we would have went to war in December 1941, right? Because the opposition to war in Europe was really still strong. So he had to take these calculated steps. And the people who have concentrated on his political policy history have always talked about how he was, quote unquote, lucky. He faced two of the greatest crises in American history, the Great Depression and World War II. And he successfully met both of those and overcame them. And there's no other president that can claim that, that kind of achievement. But Congress was really a roadblock, and they had to be moved. And I was going to read part of her Liberalism speech. It's unbelievable the stuff he was saying. I mean, he admired the New Order in Germany immensely and felt like it had a lot to teach us. And it's a damn good thing that more Americans didn't listen to him. I have another question?
Yes, this comes back to the issue of, there are two that come back to the issue of anti-Semitism. Would you tell us more about Breckinridge's role in keeping Jewish refugees out of America and talk about anti-Semitism then and now. And a related question is, please comment on the hateful myths that FDR was a Jew and a communist.
Well, partly because of his policies. I mean, if you were really strong supporter of the trade union movement at a time, and coming out of the Great Depression, so I wrote about Flint, Michigan, and the strikes there. Coming out of the Great Depression, socialists and communists had a big role in those movements. And Roosevelt aligned himself with them, as I said to you before, John L. Lewis, who was certainly coal miners' president and not a communist or a socialist. He was the one who put up the money for most of Roosevelt's national campaign using the CIO, Political Action Committee. I think that might be the first PAC in American history, the CIO PAC. I think that those connections were very, very, very easy to make. You know, him standing on a platform with the socialist union leaders, for instance. That he was a Jew because he pointed so many Jews. Because Rosamond was a Jew, his chief speechwriter. They were all around him all the time, and there was no precedent for that. That seemed to be bringing, Jews forward, and so the people who hated him spread the most hateful things they could think of, which was to say he was a Jew, and it took in such a big country. It's probably not that hard to get 1 million or more people to believe something that's totally false and irrelevant. And today, it's probably not hard to get tens of millions of people to believe that. But it was a vile attack on him, and he greatly resented it. I think, did I get that? Oh, Breckinridge Long was Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, and he did all he could to suppress any news of the Holocaust and to block any attempts to grant visas to Jews coming to the United States. And it was a very successful policy, actually. We know of famous Jews who came, like Einstein and others, but so many others did. So many, actually, the people on the ship St. Louis that I mentioned before, they got turned away in the United States. They got turned away in Cuba. They may have got turned away someplace else. They sailed back to France. They all were taken to concentration camps, and most of them were killed. And they were within feet of the United States. They just had to throw down a disembarkation ramp, and they could have been in the United States. And Long was completely behind that. And you remember, I mean, you maybe don't remember, but the entire Ivy League had anti-Semitic policies. So many organizations did. This was part of American culture at the time. Okay.
These two deal with economic questions. One from Jill. Regarding the freedom from want and the freedom from fear, would you discuss how FDR's tax proposals, namely the Revenue Acts of 1935 and 1942, or the Wealth and Victory Tax, help fund government programs and the war effort, both addressing principles of his speech, Want and Fear? Driving here on a rural road, I passed a handwritten sign, "Taxation is thievery." Can you reflect on the role of taxation and the resistance to increased taxation since FDR?
Okay. Well, this is kind of different. Taxation without representation is what we're all about, right? So taxation is a very important subject. The tax proposals were designed to relieve the pressures on the growing national deficit that was a result of these massive programs of the New Deal. And they were steeply graduated taxes. There was an inheritance tax, which is now under fire again. But that was a tax that had been imposed because it was felt like and Andrew Carnegie at a time argued this way, you know, we don't need to spoil our kids with all the money we've made. Let the government tax it at a high rate and put it to good uses for the country. That was the basic argument. And so steeply graduated taxes were part of every Roosevelt bill, and the revenue was designed to go into, especially before the war, because we had an army that was smaller and less costly than that of Portugal. We had a very big Navy, and one of the things the Navy did not like when the war began to loom on the horizon was the idea that the Army would start to get something like equal funding to the Navy, because there was a War Department, that was the Army, and there was a Department of the Navy, and that's all there was. The Department of Defense is a Cold War production, brings in a new force, the Air Force, and creates the Joint Chiefs, creates the National Security Council, Defense Act of 1949. None of that really expensive stuff, along with the security, you know, the intelligence agencies and so on, none of that existed. So most of the revenue being raised is going to be going to domestic programs. And because there were so few domestic programs to try to alleviate fear of hunger and want and underdevelopment in the rural areas. America was still basically a rural country as late as 1930, that this would be the money that could bring us up to the standards of what the modern technology, a modern world. And it wasn't passed to fund military, the growth of the military. That only comes with the war emergency when it was desperately needed to win the war. Oh, let's see, taxation is thievery. Well, I think citizens have to recognize that they have responsibilities. And if we have a voice as well as responsibility, our voice should tell us, tax us, but tax us reasonably at rates we can afford for our income level, our income group, and spend the money on things that will improve our social security and maintain our national security, but not launch these projects overseas. Remember, we're supposed to have learned not to try to build nations in Vietnam, but then we went into Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, and it doesn't work. People in a world that has been this is a fundamental fact of global history, so big it's almost hard to get your head around it. For most of recorded history, large sections of the world are divided between empires who have tension along their borders, but a lot of times they're very stable, they're trading with each other. It's a world of empires. You know, people, a ruling class at home, and then lots of subject people all around the world, their leaders often drawn from the local population, but it's a world of empires. Empire is discredited. Decolonization is an amazing thing. The fact that it's taken a while, the fact that it takes a while to take a country that hasn't been economically developed and which has had no democratic participation by its people, that has in that sense had no citizens in it, to come around to a point of stable and ongoing development, peaceful development, I would say, looking at history, you should expect that will take a while. And in the big picture historical terms, that's way more than one lifetime. Yeah, it's way more than one lifetime. But it is an amazing world we live in now, that one where most people feel like they are a citizen in a country, not a subject in some empire.
Two questions that relate to the international field. Please give us your take on the effectiveness or lack of the International Court of Justice. Should the United States recognize the court? And then from Debbie at URI, could the UN reorganize into a more effective organization? Is there a way to get rid of the big five single source veto power?
Oh, that's a loaded one. Let's start with the court. The United States plays a major role in negotiating the Treaty of Rome that sets up the International Criminal Court. When I was directing War and Peace Studies, we had Clinton's ambassador, David Sheffer, who was the ambassador to that treaty negotiation here. And he said clearly that the objections that were being raised to the treaty, that this would subject American, especially we're emphasizing military personnel, to trial in a foreign international court, were absolutely wrong, because the treaty says that the International Court of Justice, or excuse me, of Criminal Court, because there is an international court, that's previous Hague creation, that settles disputes between countries. The International Criminal Court would only accept cases that were referred to them by the government of the country where the perpetrator committed the crimes, or was refusing to use criminal prosecution against those perpetrators. They would accept those cases. So since the United States has virtually all the provisions of the laws of war, they actually in a way originate. Lincoln's armies, after 1863, carried a code, and their officers carried a code with them known as Lieber's Code, named for Franz Lieber, a Columbia University law professor, who wrote basically the outlines of the Hague and Geneva Conventions with the essential distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, distinguish between necessary destruction and wanton destruction. Those are two basic principles. That's part of the military code. That's part of the United States Code. The only place, as Sheffer said, where United States officers or enlisted men would be tried would be in American courts, probably the military courts. They would never go to the international. So it was a completely bogus charge that the anti-internationalists people in Congress jumped on, and tell the American population in vague terms that some court over in The Hague is going to be trying American servicemen, and they're going to say, oh, we don't want that. No. But that was actually never going to happen. And I think it could be improved, and there's an attempt to improve it, by bringing in more than African defendants, because the first defendants were all African, and now they've started to do that. But it's a very long, involved process. And in a way, it's a good lesson for people who pay attention on what's going on in parts of the world that we usually don't pay attention to, where we're not hearing about the atrocities in other places right now. We're mostly Gaza and Ukraine, but and especially in Somalia, South Sudan, Eastern Congo, those are places where horrible things are happening, and where people probably should be brought in if their local governments won't prosecute them. So that, I think, is, and should we recognize that? We shouldn't have de-recognized it. We should have done what the Clinton administration was doing, which was recognize the court, participate in its creation, and recognize, like we participated in the creation of most international organizations. As far as the UN reorganization, it's been attempted several times. Kofi Annan had a very complex plan to change the rules and to rotate seats in the Security Council and to diminish the veto power of the major five powers. It wouldn't wash. And it wouldn't wash because three of the main powers, especially United States, Russia now, and China, would not approve of it. And it needed their backing to reform it. But the reform plan is still there, and I'm sure there's people trying to figure out a way, how can we at least modify some of this Security Council? Because there's real tension between the General Assembly and the Security Council on a lot of issues right now.
This is probably the good question to end on.
Yeah.
Do you think there is hope? If so, where is it? Can the world survive?
The last one I don't know, and that would include, is one of these comets or asteroids going to hit us? That's the latest sort of version of nuclear fear displaced to something else. What are we at, 3 or 5% of some massive space objects slamming into Earth in the next 30 years? I don't know about that stuff. But can we? I think we have it in us. and if I just go, I used a book. It's a wonderful book. You want to read a wonderful book? It's called Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century. It's by Jonathan Glover, who made himself into a historian, but he was a philosopher and psychologist. And he wanted to study the psychology of war and peace. And here's what I think. We are a collection of instincts, and our environment brings out the expression of those instincts. We have humane instincts and inhumane. Okay, let me do the inhumane first. We have an instinct for aggression, aggressive violence. We know that. We see it. People fight. Put a gun in hand, they might shoot each other. Get the group together, there might be a gang war. They'll fight. We have aggressions for actually enjoying people's suffering. The photographs from Abu Ghraib, what did we see? American soldiers put in an environment where no rules applied, where they had prisoners who they did not view as human. What did they do? Put dog leashes around them, put electrodes on them, tortured them. And they had a party, and that was what was so appalling about that. We have a lot of different instincts. On the positive side, he thinks we have three basic ones that are the reasons for hope, so that's what I'll end on. We have an instinct for respect, to recognize as human, a human species, a human being like ourselves, other people. And he gives the best example is a South African policeman and a black female demonstrator in South Africa before apartheid. He's ready to beat her. She catches his eyes with her eyes. He stops, backs off, holds her, and she's free. Okay? Respect. I respect you all of you. Respect. If you have respect for other people, sympathy is evoked if they're in any kind of pain, mental, physical pain. That's why seeing all of these scenes of destruction, whether they're from natural events or from warfare, fighting, murders, thousands of murders in the United States every year, suffering, the people that's grieving families. Our hearts go out to them. We feel it. We feel it deep inside us. So we have respect and sympathy are critical instincts that we have. We also have, and he argues this as a psychologist, a psychological need to think or feel we are good, that we do good things, that we have good reasons for being in the world and we're doing good things. And psychopaths convince themselves that going on a murder spree, is a good thing. And that's why they'll do it. And we see them as seriously mentally disturbed, remove them from society. But if we can create in people this sense of respect for others, that's why this sense of include everybody. America is everybody in America. And see that they're human like us. What comes out are not the inhumane instincts expressed, but the humane instincts. And we gather in different kinds of gatherings where we celebrate this. It might be in church, it might be in a meeting like this, it might be in a picnic on the 4th of July, it might be with backyard with our family, it might be in a soccer stadium with everybody who's with us on that one, and suddenly all these strangers are part of this human family we're part of. So the fact that we have the instinctual abilities, and we've been showing it over time, building a more and more peaceful societies, more and more peaceful societies. This is not such a peaceful society. Not most societies have so many guns and weapons of destruction distributed so widely that I think there is hope. And there is a way forward. There's lots of people developing different ways to do this. So work together with other people, show respect for the people you don't know, the strangers, unless they tell you you shouldn't respect them because of whatever they're doing. And we may get there, okay? That's my message of hope.
Thank you very much, Ron.
I'll save these as souvenirs.